let me just show you where I'm hoping to head. Sorry, let's get this all coordinated and going. All right, where I'm hoping to head over the next 45 minutes or so, I want to tell you kind of my how I perceive the field of environmental and occupational health. Talk very briefly about how I fit in and kind of a little bit about my background and how that shapes where I want to go. And then I'll talk about kind of three pieces of a vision for the EOH department here at the School of Public Health. One having to do with education, another having to do with research and research to practice, both of these organized around climate and health. We'll spend the most amount of time on that part two. And then the third piece is really kind of building the infrastructure to support these lofty goals. What I see for the field of environmental and occupational health and how I perceive this field, well, I would argue that environmental and occupational health scientists are those grappling with some of the most vexing health challenges of our time. The most notable and prominent, perhaps, is this one. These are a series of statements from the National Climate Assessment, the fourth National Climate Assessment, which came out in 2017. There's now a fifth National Climate Assessment. But there is scientific consensus that climate change is now impacting human health, and the impacts of climate change on human health will become more profound over time. And many people in our field are trying to wrangle with big questions about who is exposed, who is most vulnerable, and what ultimately we might do to promote health in the changing climate. I think it's also important to realize that it is not just climate change that our field deals with, although I think climate change is so huge, it could be a whole undertaking in of itself. Environmental health scientists are often tasked with dealing with the emerging challenges of our time. This is an example of PFAS, the perf and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which it has been clear that we are essentially ubiquitous in our environment. And this is a headline from a National Academies meeting that happened in 2019. That really gets at the questions environmental and occupational health scientists are often asked to answer. Who might be exposed? What are the pathways of exposure? And what does that mean for health? And then ultimately, what might we do to control exposure and promote health? Similarly, John touched on the COVID-19 pandemic, and there is a role for environmental and occupational health scientists in the infectious disease realm as well, and is responding to kind of the probably defining infectious disease of our generation, both in terms of questions of how, again, these same questions: who is exposed? What are the potential routes of exposure? What are the things we can do to reduce exposure and promote health? So I am going to offer you, as you eat your lunches, a brief pop quiz. This is the only quiz that I will ask you to participate in, but here is your multi-choice answer. Environmental and occupational health sciences is A, a multidisciplinary topic-driven field, B, a methods-driven field suited to assessing complex health challenges, or C, both A and B. So how many people say A? How many people say B? How many people say C? Right. It's the tension between, is it the longest answer or is it the and answer? So yes, I would like to convince you that we are certainly at C. And here are what I see as the foundational methods in environmental and occupational health that many of us are taught in introductory EOH courses. Of course, there is toxicology, which is really grappling with the mechanisms that govern injury and repair at often the cellular or sometimes the systems level, using in vitro and in vivo assays, often under experimental conditions. There is the whole discipline of exposure assessment, right? How do we measure exposure, both in the environment and as it enters the human body? And what are the pathways of exposure that matter? Then, of course, there's the field of environmental and occupational epi. And I think of this as having kind of two parts. One part is primary data collection, where people are going out and designing their own studies, collecting their own data, And another piece that I think is a growing area in environmental and occupational health are these environmental data sciences, where people are making smart use of available data sets to try to ask these questions about population exposures and population level health, right? And these three kind of foundational skills can get married in risk assessment, which task is really an integrative one, right? How do we combine evidence from risk, from tox, from exposure assessment, from EPI to understand population risks? And within there, how do we understand who is most exposed, who might be disproportionately exposed, and who might be most vulnerable? And additionally, another synthetic piece we have here is policy and implementation. And I think the questions here can go in both directions. One, how does policy and practice, how are those decisions around policy and practice made based on the evidence we generate in environmental and occupational health? And then also the inverse, right? How are the policies and practices that are put in place impacting environmental and occupational health? So this is what I see as kind of the foundational methods in EOH. Another way of thinking about this is a slight ode to the late Quirk Smith, who gave me this graphic many years ago. I like this graphic not only for the 1970s kind of pictograph here, but I think it really goes from source to health effects with spaces to think about toxicology, exposure assessment, risk assessment, but also to really set up to think about interventions. Where along this pathway might we intervene to reduce risk and ultimately promote health? We use kind of an adapted version of this in my research group. This is a graphic for COVID-19 from 2020, when there was lots of discussion about what might be the relevant exposure pathway for SARS-CoV-2. So you could have an infected host who's emitting those droplets and aerosols. Those droplets and aerosols can concentrate in a room on surfaces in terms of they can concentrate in the air, they can fall to the ground. You put people in that room and they can be exposed, and ultimately you can have health effects. And at the time, the big question was really a basic exposure assessment question, right? Is the exposure happening because people are inhaling aerosols? Is the exposure happening because people are having direct contact with those droplets? That 3-foot rule that got expanded to 6-foot rule. Is it about indirect contact via fomites, either the aerosols or the droplets falling? And Dr. Salmon did a lot of work in this area trying to help people think through this puzzle of which of these exposure pathways might be most important. This is the last model I'll throw up here, which is the risk assessment model that many of us are very familiar with. But this idea that in environmental health, we think about hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And to have human health effects, you need all three. You need some sort of hazard with the potential to cause harm. You need some sort of exposure. So you need people to be exposed to that hazard, and they can be exposed at different levels, and there may be some sort of thresholding, right? So the exposure above some threshold is what really matters. And then you need some sort of vulnerability. Sometimes everybody is vulnerable. Sometimes a subset of the population, very old, very young, someone who's immune compromised, might be the people who are at highest risk. But this concept, this tool, has been used prominently by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to really think about climate risks generally and climate health risks in particular. This graphic here on your right is really, an adaptation of that basic risk assessment pictograph there. And this is kind of a foundational conceptual diagram used in climate and health world. Okay. So I am going to spend and this last piece, this is an announcement for Research of Progress our department did in April of 2020. And I think it's really a testament to the fact that in April of 2020, none of us had spent time building expertise in COVID-19 before January of 2020, right? It was all new. And it shows the breadth of different applications of these core EOH skills to this very complex emerging challenges. Everything from kind of what types of masks should we use, to how do we build models to understand which interventions might be effective in preventing overwhelm of our hospitals, to how do we work with workers and employers to promote health in the workplaces. So let me talk a little bit about how I see I fit into EOH, and a little briefly about my background, which John covered. I was an undergrad at Yale and ended up working in a Lyme disease lab as a research assistant. It was my one foray into bench science. I helped collect ticks off of mice in a lab colony. I rapidly realized that was not my calling, and the lab assistant, I think, was quite grateful when I became more interested in the data portion of things. But at the time, the lab was starting to think, this is the 1990s, but how we might use GIS, how we might use ecological data on deer and mice to understand how Lyme disease might spread in Connecticut, which was the epicenter there. And I found that quite fascinating. I then went off, as John mentioned, into Peace Corps. I had the privilege of living on this ridge line in rural Western Honduras, which was perhaps one of the most beautiful places I ever lived, surrounded by cloud forests. There ended up spending a lot of my professional time and my recreational time thinking about water in that cloud forest are essentially the storage bank, much like snowbanks here in Colorado, for water, and many communities rely on gravity-fed water systems there with all sorts of potential to wash down not just water, but also pesticides from the coffee farms, mining trailings, and infectious pathogens. And so lots of thinking about this overlay of how environmental management may impact health. And then I kind of wanted the polar opposite experience of living on a ridge in rural Honduras and moved to New York City, where I kind of took the only job I could find where I could be speaking Spanish. So I was working on a study of cockroaches, mice, and allergens in New York City public housing. In the Columbia, the New York City Public Health Department, New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene at the time, and the New York City Housing Authority had agreed to do a study looking at a pest control intervention and how that might impact both pest levels, which are quite annoying and problematic for quality of life in public housing in New York City, and also allergens and asthma. So I joke that I traded ticks for cockroaches in my 20s, but it was a really fascinating experience in terms of standing up a fairly complex primary data collection study, and our team spent a large amount of time, first in public housing developments in East Harlem, and then in Bushwick, Brooklyn, kind of thinking about how context can impact health. So from there, I kind of took the road that many of you are now familiar with in my career. I started working as a doctoral student on schistosomiasis in Southwest China. We were, as John mentioned, trying to understand why schistosomiasis persists and is somewhat recalcitrant to elimination in an area targeted for elimination in Southwest China. And I won't make this a lecture on schistosomiasis, but I will say the transmission pathway is complex. And one of the things I've really loved throughout my career is dealing with complex systems. It involves some sort of mammalian host, a snail, and a need for fresh water. And the group I worked with built mathematical models about the system. And again, I won't make this a mathematical modeling lecture, but I think the beauty of mathematical models and where I found them useful throughout my career is that essentially what you do is come up with a set of equations to define relationships between different parts of the system. So it forces you to come up with a conceptual framework, to state your assumptions about that framework, and try to understand where the weaknesses are in your assumption. And my job has often been to think about what data we might find to improve our assumptions in the weakest parts of the model. And then also increasingly thinking about what are these big environmental forces that could perturb the system, like climate change. And that led me in my kind of early, kind of in my assistant professorship to think about the impact of climate on infectious disease dynamics, particularly waterborne diseases. And mostly in work I did with Karen Levy, who's now at the University of Washington, we put together a series of studies, first a data analysis, and then a systematic review and meta-analysis, trying to understand the potential impacts of mostly rainfall and temperature on diarrheal illness. And by putting together this body of evidence, I think it was really helpful for me in thinking about how we go from data analysis to a line of evidence in a report. Our work was ultimately cited in the National Climate Assessment. I joke that 5 years of work is like half of a sentence in that assessment. But, there's really now consensus, thanks in part to work we did and many others, that climate, particularly rainfall and temperature, profoundly impacts diarrheal illness. It was recently cited the IPCC, which leads me to where I think we need to go now. So Karen and I wrote this review commentary in 2018, specific to waterborne diseases and climate change. And what we said is that a lot of the work that has been done is trying to link historic conditions to climate drivers to answer this really basic and fundamental question that needs to be answered about what are the potential relationships between observed weather and, in this case, diarrheal disease, but put in health outcome X. But I think what we really want to be, where we want to be, is able to answer this question, which is what interventions should be prioritized to reduce vulnerability and promote health in a changing climate, right? And I think this is where our field needs to go right now, is really focusing on building the evidence base so that we can be thinking about adaptation to climate change and promoting evidence-based strategies. Okay, so a little bit about my vision for EOH. And this is kind of a three-part potential of where we could go. So I wanted to think a little bit about where we might be able to be 5 years from now. And this first piece, is really about creating leadership in education around climate and health. So I think our school has the potential, and our department in particular, to really be a national leader in climate and health education. I think there's a lot of space there. There's a lot of courses like the one I teach on an introduction to climate and health. There's a lot of space to figure out what that curriculum needs to be beyond there. And I think our department has been wrangling with those questions because of the new PhD in climate and health, which is really exciting. I think we have the potential to build an additional program. The faculty have many coalesced around this idea of building also an MS in climate and health that can allow us to expand our educational offerings and really train students who might not be ready for doctoral level education, but want to take on kind of a depth of expertise so that they can be leaders in climate solutions. I think this has the potential to address enrollment, and we can talk about that in a minute. I think we really need to be thinking about innovation and education and how we can teach these core EOH skills and kind of use climate as a motivating example, but also build the ability to pivot to other emerging health challenges as they emerge, right? You build that core skill base that can be used, and to maintain our MPH in environmental and occupational health as our kind of core educational mission. I think there's also potential for us to be a source of non-degree trainings in climate and health for the public health workforce that may not, for one reason or another, want a master's degree, but may feel the need, the acute need to address climate, to develop fluency in how to address climate in their workplace, and need some tools to go there. So I'll talk in detail on a couple of these points. I wanted to kind of address the elephant in the room, which is we talk a lot about our need to grow student populations. This is not an easy row to hoe, in part because of the decline in the number of students who are in college right now. This somewhat noisy graphic shows the number of 18 to 24-year-olds in college. So in 2011, it was 47% of males and 52% of females. In 2022, that declined to 39% of males and 48% of females. Why this is more marked for males than females, and also why these declines, but that obviously poses a challenge. The additional challenge, of course, is that we've had a real growth in programs, in graduate programs in schools of public health. This graph only goes up until 2016, but it shows the growth in the number of graduate degrees offered in public health, which has been increasing over time, particularly since the founding of our school. And I think the third challenge, but perhaps also opportunity, is there has been an explosion in the number of ways we can teach. This perhaps has been accelerated by COVID-19. And I would argue as a school and also as a department, we really need to wrangle by what we mean and what our different programs are offering in terms of these different modalities. So there's everything from the fully online asynchronous format to fully in person, but there's a lot of room in between. Everything from kind of online with occasional remote sessions to having some online curriculum, semester-long courses that are fully online, perhaps with remote sessions, but then addressing the student desire for in-person cohort building, building relationships with faculty, perhaps through short courses on campus for those who are in rural areas or for one reason or another not able to be on campus every week. And other options. I think a lot of us were in that high flex space as we pivoted back into in-person, where we taught in person, but allowed students to attend remotely. So I would argue that for our department to be successful here, we really need to evaluate what are the modalities that will be responsive to the desired student population classrooms. And I know some of that is underway at the school. I just also wanted to say a comment on kind of my teaching philosophy and how we might think about climate and health education. I think about teaching as kind of building a layer cake, where on one level you have these core EOH skills you're trying to teach. On the next level, you have some sort of motivating example grounding this in a real world problem. And that allows students to build a depth of expertise. And we could say climate and health broadly, but we could also be more granular on air pollution, on water contaminants, on environmental justice and disparate exposures. But building those depth of expertise in a content area. And then additionally building these core public health skills, everything from public speaking to critical analysis of the literature to ability to wrangle with biostatistical analyses. So ideally, if we can do this, we can create graduates who have the skills not only to deal with the climate crisis, but when there is the next SARS-CoV-2 or the next PFAS, those graduates are also able to deal with that emerging health crisis. Okay, I'll spend a few minutes here on leadership in research and research to practice in climate and health. So here is where some possibilities of where we might be 5 years from now. I think we have the potential to be a national leader in defining the health impacts of climate change, identifying who might be most impacted, and rigorously evaluating adaptation and mitigation strategies. So particularly what are the potential health benefits and potential health harms of strategies? I think we could grow our faculty through strategic hires that complement our current areas of strength and allow us to build out emerging areas of interest to attain this vision. I think we have potential to build a capital C center around climate and health, which probably would be comprised of a number of lowercase c centers that address different components of climate and health. Climate and health is complex. And I think there are ways we can think about climate and worker health and climate and rural health, about air pollution, about infectious diseases. And we may need to triangulate to get funding in place to really build a research program. But that overlay of centers, I think, or overlay of research programming would be quite important. And then I think we also have the potential to build this kind of hub of research that has tentacles that reach across Colorado, across the CU campus, to Boulder, and engaging with many of the agencies that are here in Colorado already that have stake in this game. It was really, really nice at the climate symposium that happened a few weeks ago to see NOAA representatives present saying, we're ready, we want to collaborate. And we have had similar conversations in the past with folks at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. I think there's also potential with CDC as well. Okay, so I'm going to kind of take a foray for about 5 minutes to 10 minutes to say kind of where I think the climate and health research agenda needs to go. I will put a giant asterisk on this, and that I do think ultimately laying out the agenda for the department will require working with the faculty to get, to agree on where we want to go. But this is where I see the needs are. So I'll walk through these 4 points. One, I think we often talk about climate change, but we don't always think about exposure science as we talk about climate change. And I would argue that climate is a really complex exposure. We have these things that can be measured every day, like temperature and rainfall and wind velocity. We have these events that can happen, like floods or heat waves. And we have sometimes long-term climate exposures that matter, like drought or rainy periods. All of which, when you think about this through this lens of exposure science, mean that one of the key questions is which of these exposures matter for each disease pathway. Andrea Buchwald, a former postdoc of mine, published this really nice paper working with folks at CU Boulder, trying to untangle for safe drinking water use, what are the climate predictors that predict use of safe drinking water use? So for those of you who don't work in this space, many people, when there's inadequate infrastructure, actually have multiple drinking water sources. So they daisy chain together different sources. They'll use the pipes when the pipes are running, the electricity's on, and then they'll use well 1 when that fails, and then they'll use this kind of suboptimal source 2 when those both are failing. So we were trying to understand, how does weather impact which sources people are using? And she used a machine learning approach to try to untangle, came up with this large set of potential predictors, which weather variables are predicting safe drinking water use. I mean, that's just one example of how we might try to parse relevant exposures. I think the other thing that's emerged is sometimes it's combinations of exposures that matter. In my world, we've seen that rainy periods following drought appear to be the most risky in terms of spikes in diarrheal disease. This is something we found in early work in Ecuador, whereas when you had a heavy rainfall event that followed a period where average 8-week rainfall was low, you had an increase in diarrheal disease risk. And actually, when the heavy rainfall event occurred during a rainy period, you had a decrease. This result has held up in the literature. This one has not really been replicated. And in fact, there was this really nice review done by Alicia Cray with my colleague Karen Levy, showing that there is really now a body of evidence suggesting this combination of events is particularly risky. So from a biostats perspective, this is interesting, right? Because you have to think of this overlay, this interaction, right, between 2 events that are causing risk. The meteorologists and the climate scientists hate this because it's hard enough to predict what one thing would happen, but it requires a different level of precision to predict this overlay of 2. But I think this also gets to the complexity of climate health pathways and the ability of environmental health scientists who have the toolkit to think about exposure to really start to untangle some of these puzzles. Okay, my second pitch in terms of where we need to go is we need to be thinking about mechanisms. What are the mechanisms by which climate impacts health? And I'll showcase this really nice paper that Elise Grover just submitted. It's now on medRxiv, on trying to understand the relationship between COVID and weather. So big picture, we actually don't think weather plays a huge role in COVID transmission. However, we have amazing data for COVID, and because we want a level of precision in predicting respiratory viruses like flu and COVID, understanding the climate signal can help us potentially with prediction. So the dogma is that in the colder months, people go indoors, there's more transmission indoors, and then it leads to increase in SARS-CoV-2. So she used a mediation analysis and a whole bunch of cell phone-based mobility data and building footprints so that we can classify people as indoors and outdoors to try to understand this relationship between COVID, weather, and mobility. This is just the mobility data. I think it's really interesting. It's January 2020 to February 2021, so early days. What's interesting, you can see this dramatic spike in peak time at home, obviously, when people stay-at-home order is issued. You can also see the big snowfall event we had in late fall of 2021 or 2020. So she merged these two. And actually what she found is that we don't see evidence that mobility is what is driving this relationship between weather and COVID. We do see that weather and COVID are related. That is well established in the literature, but it's our analysis suggests it perhaps is not through that mobility pathway. And when we talk about transmission, we often think about changing contact rates. This is all why we're asked to stay at home, or also transmission probability, the probability of transmission if you're exposed to the pathogen. This is suggesting that it's that transmission probability. For some reason, the virus survives longer or it's aerosolized for longer periods of time in these certain weather conditions. So again, big picture, I think we need to be thinking about mechanisms and unpacking these mechanisms, because that's a tool by which we might understand interventions. Okay. I think it's also really important to emphasize what many of us know, that climate rarely acts alone. This is this statement from the Lancet Commission that really highlights that climate change exacerbates social, economic, and demographic inequalities, with the impacts eventually felt by all, but disproportionately felt by some. And this is a study we did in West Africa looking at 80s-borne disease risk. And I won't belabor the details of this. This is really a review of the literature and kind of evidence synthesis. But what we saw is there has been an increase in 80s-borne disease, things like chikungunya and dengue in West Africa, and actually a decline in surveillance for mosquito vectors over that same period. And so our question was, what is driving this? And on one hand, and sorry, one other finding we had here is that these newer outbreaks of 80s-borne disease were happening in urban areas, whereas the old 1950s outbreaks were happening likely from sylvatic spillover cycles. So one thing that's been happening in West Africa is tremendous amount of urbanization. This is the number of people living in cities in select West African countries from the 1960s to 2020, explosive growth of the urban population. We know that 80s mosquitoes, they're like the cockroaches of the mosquito world. They love to thrive in really dirty they can thrive in very little pools of water and contaminated or dirty pools of water and thrive in urban environments. At the same time, climate change has been happening. Again, this is this climate as its complex exposure. We know that based on work of others, that climate heat can accelerate the reproductive cycle of the mosquito and the reproductive cycle of the virus. Climate change is also driving desertification in the Sahel, pushing people into cities, right? So you have this overlay of these two phenomenon happening at once. And so this ability to deal with complexity, to look at these different forcers on health, I think it's really important. And I'll just say, I think this issue of migration and displacement, which is touched on in some ways by our disasters and emergency preparedness certificate, is one that we are going to have to wrangle with as a School of Public Health. There's anticipated increasing levels of displacement of populations due to climate change moving forward. Okay, last piece in terms of research agenda, I think we need to be talking about adaptation. And just to put us all on the same page, mitigation in the climate speak is really about reducing carbon emissions. We're turning off the faucet that is leading to global warming, or carbon capture, so we are reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Adaptation is kind of everything else. Okay, so the climate is changing. What do we need to do to protect health or reduce other harms in this changing climate? And increasingly, we're talking about resilience, and this is just this ability to recover after insult, right? And in the climate space, this is really important as we expect more extreme climate events. So how do we build resiliency in communities so that we can recover rapidly, and also that we can change practices to protect health? Australia has released a national health and climate strategy. And it's really interesting to see their emphasis on, in part, promoting health co-benefits, both of adaptation strategies and mitigation strategies. So how can we promote health in a changing climate? The US has not yet done this. I think this is a space we're hoping will be built out in the coming years. And I think it would be really fantastic if school public health can contribute to this type of assessment. I pulled out the infectious disease piece, so that's what we think about, but I think what's really interesting is a lot of the adaptation pieces are bread and butter of public health. We need better surveillance for emerging infectious diseases, for example. We need better coordination across different sectors so we can spot problems and respond. So I think the vision is that we can build an evidence base that allows us to identify how and when adaptation strategies should be deployed to reduce disease, promote health, and the changing climate. I have this commentary that's coming out hopefully in EHP this month. I thought it was going to be last month, but really talking in the water sanitation space. There's new evidence that water and sanitation interventions effects change with weather, so they can offer more or less protection. And I think this is a small snippet of where we need to go as a field to really understand how interventions can protect against climate, but also how climate may impact the interventions we use in public health. Okay. And so I'll just say there's work that we did in Ecuador that's been replicated in this massive study suggesting that after heavy rainfall events, drinking water treatment may provide some protection so that people who have access to or who treat their drinking water may not be susceptible to diarrheal diseases during following heavy rainfall events. And I think this is interesting to think about because if you think about climate driving changes in risk over time, and if we can identify these high risk periods, then there is a potential to identify additional layers of interventions that we may put in at these high risk periods. So, in the WASH space, we should have water and sanitation, period, right? We don't want to just have safe drinking water when it's a high risk period, but do you layer on an additional intervention? And this is similar to what the heat world has been talking about for years, right? We need cooling centers. We need this ability to flex when we have these high risk periods. So I think leadership here will require linkages both to policy and understanding the decision-making practices around policies and practice, right? How do we build adaptation strategies? Okay, so I'll just talk in this last section about perhaps the least glamorous part of things, but I think to build these two other pieces of vision, I think we do also need a strong department that really helps faculty, staff, and students thrive. And if I might be honest, I think many of the faculty in EOH feel that 3 years without a permanent department chair has been challenging. So there is a lot that we, I think, want to build in terms of shoring up our department. Obviously, student enrollment, which is in part addressed by that part one of the vision. I think we really want to recruit and retain a diverse set of students, faculty, and staff. And I think that will require both being creative about how we build our pipelines, but also building a culture of strong mentoring in place in our department. I think we need, we really want to build this strong national reputation. I think national level searches for faculty can help. I also think lecture series that pull in experts that allow us to be kind of a hub for interesting emerging topics and dialogue can both help stimulate ideas among our faculty and student and also connect us to leaders in the field elsewhere. Everybody wants scholarship monies, but I think it really does need to be stated that that can be a real strong hook to pull in students and to lead to kind of innovative work that may not be yet fundable by traditional funding agencies, and also kind of research assistantships and building a culture where we are submitting grants that has support for students on our grants. I'll say a little bit about this web of collaborators on the next couple slides. And then I think, the long vision is building faculty and students who have nimbleness, right? This ability to respond to the existential crisis of our time, but also emerging environmental and occupational health challenges. Just wanted to say a word about mentoring, because I think this is really important for kind of recruiting and retaining talented faculty, staff, and students. This is this really nice training that Ivan Ramirez did down at the Denver campus, kind of advocating to shift away from the guru model of mentoring towards this network model of mentoring, that we need a network. And we need to really be encouraging junior faculty in particular, and probably postdocs, to think about the diverse mentoring needs they have at different points in their careers and how they might find people to help coach them. And also, I think, the responsibility needs to be on not just the mentee, but the mentors, and finding ways to reward mentoring in, for example, annual reviews, I think will be important. I think EOH already has a pretty fantastic network through their collaborators, but there's a lot of work we could do to strengthen and formalize those ties. For example, building a relationship with our external advisory board, tapping into the many federal agencies in Colorado, some of which have hosted our students in the past, and then building relationships with state and local public health departments. I think many of us are doing this already, but really building on those. And then ultimately using our alumni as well to kind of build this web of our reach as a department. And I think this network can really help in terms of strategic input about where we should go. It can provide student research and practicum opportunities. It can be a source of jobs for our graduates. It can be a source of collaborations for both research and practice. I think one of the interesting things about my collaborations with CDPHE has been it's a good inspiration for questions we should be asking, right? If you can keep those doors of communication open. And also a potential point for student recruitment. So I will end here with this picture. This is my kid hiking through one of our favorite places in Colorado that was ravaged, like many places in Colorado, by a forest fire in 2021. And I think this is both kind of a sad and hopeful photo, but I think the generation that is my son's generation and the decade, slightly decade older than him, really understand the gravity of the situation we are facing in terms of the climate crisis and many emerging health challenges that we face. And I think our department has the potential to really build solutions that can offer our students, our children, and that next generation some hope. Some kind of brighter futures ahead. So I will stop here. Thank you for listening to the very long talks. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Easy question first. Where's the trail?
Oh, well, I have to debate whether I want to tell you. It's in Rocky Mountain National Park. Yes, it's very beautiful. Happy to tell you.
Okay, and for those of you online, there are a few of you do have questions. Please put them in chat. Please, comments and questions.
Hi, Ben.
Well, so okay, we'll start. In terms of kind of this climate and health vision, do you foresee kind of like starting with Colorado specific? You gave a lot of examples of like global work that you've done. So how would you think about kind of like prioritizing where that work should go to kind of build this?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think as a school of public health and as a department, we have to show our relevance to Colorado. And I think while my work that I showed here has largely been global, there's a number of people, including yourself and others, who have really built relationships in Colorado that could be foundational. You know, Kathy James has his Senate proposal, or the Senate planning proposal, thinking about rural areas. So I think that has to be a component. I think we also need to be strategic and think about where we can get funding. So, you know, that can be a linchpin, but if there is potential to, for example, Thomas and I have been thinking about AIDS-borne diseases in India, like that can be a layer on and build computational capacity that we could use to build an analytical core in a center. I think that could be a way to think strategically about your proposals.
Just kind of a quick side note. So something I wasn't aware of, but it seems like all these states have these like state climate offices, which I mean, my sense is they kind of collect a bunch of data and then send off some reports, but there doesn't really seem to kind of be a tie-in with like the state public health department, you know, a lot of kind of academic research.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is the Colorado model, it sits within CDPHE, but I have to say, I feel like this is something we do need to fully understand. There may be people in this department who understand it better than I do. And yeah, it appears in different places, right? Because there's also this local level, like the Denver, I forget what the acronym is, but there's an Office for Sustainability and Climate. So building those strategic, at least understandings of what these offices are doing and who might be strategic partners.
Maybe just a quick follow-up, because many institutions are linking in their training climate and sustainability. And do you see that as part of what we should be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, and right. So sustainability, I think, is part of this building a training program that ultimately can build healthy futures and changing climate, right? I think there are ways to do sustainability that don't include health, right? And I don't think we want to go that far afield, but I think creating those linkages to programs that have sustainability. I know our department has been talking some about these kind of sustainability certificates and some of our graduates have pursued, and whether that's a joint education program with another school.
Yeah, thanks, great talk. Can you maybe elaborate about the synergies that you see between the field of climate and health and the One Health movement, the One Health community, also the local in Colorado for planetary health? And maybe a second part of that question would be from environmental risk factors that you and to a healthy environment per se. How do you see that transition?
Yeah, oh, thank you for that question. I mean, I think it's an interesting question in a week where there has been an H1N1 case in a dairy worker, right? Like the overlay of human health, ag health, worker health in that, kind of emerging situation is really paramount. You have more expertise in One Health than I do, but I do think it is a really useful tool for thinking about how we might address the complexity of many human health challenges, particularly in the infectious disease space. And so, one of the places where we might think strategically in terms of building relationships is with the One Health Institute at CSU, which creates a portal for connection to the veterinary school there. Probably mostly in the infectious disease space, but also overlays with the ag space and in the occupational health space in terms of ag workers there. So I don't know if you have other things you want to add. Please.
Thank you, Beth. Great talk. I want to understand a little bit more around, you mentioned there's now actually 150 schools and programs are going on. Enrollments are going down. How do we address that? And a follow-up will be, what do you think we can be world-class at? Either by the people you have now in the department or one or two more strategic recruits, so that we can differentiate ourselves versus being, you got to be in it to be a public health school.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the answers to those questions are very related, right? So if we can be world-class in X, it is a way to pull students, right? That recognition does matter. I think to try to answer your first question first, I think climate is a way to build there's an appetite for wrangling with the climate question that could help pull in students. I think building an MS program in the long term can help build a student population that may want more flexibility than an MPH can provide. So, and then by building that climate and health programmatic piece, it builds a set of educational tools and outreach that will also serve to pull students into the MPH program, akin to what we saw with global health programs a decade ago. So I think there's climate as a hook that we can use. I do think there's huge appetite for student scholarships, and the ability to advertise a priority that we have scholarships available can also be a hook for students. I think a lot of students want thought that there was an option, so that's another. I think where we can be world-class is probably in the climate health space, but that is also huge, right? And I think as a faculty, we really need to wrangle with, where within that space we go. I think there is a depth of expertise in our school that really can think about that intersectionality of exposure of kind of structural historical challenges that have led to disproportionate exposures in populations and what that means for health. And if we could marry those in a way that's transformational, I think that could be profound. You know, I'm not going to advocate that we build a center of excellence in, for example, air pollution, but that's there already. So we need to be creative and nimble. I think the other piece is potentially a rural health bridge, which really links nicely to some of the occupational work in the project as well. So
I was gonna just ask if you could, as you're answering that question, think about what you think about developing for this climate and health education and research, the partnerships with the world-class modeling organizations in climate that are here in Colorado.
that's very true. I think many of us are bridge builders in this department. The risk of being a bridge builder is you build a lot of bridges, but then you don't have, you know, that thing at the center. But I think that is absolutely, and you know, John and I were talking this morning. I think there's a lot of appetite for health expertise in different disciplines, even from respiratory to NOAA being kind of at this climate health symposium a few weeks ago, saying we want to work with health people, we can't quite figure out how. If we can be strategic about those partnerships. NCAR historically has been a partner, and Katie kind of came out of NCAR thinking about how we might build some of these relationships as well.
Just another bridge building question for you. I know there's possibilities for adjustment on the departments on campus. We probably haven't done that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and do you mean outside of school of public health?
Well, I was thinking inside school of public health, like in the students.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this work, bridges, biostats, bridges ethnic, bridges community behavioral health, particularly as we start thinking about the adaptation piece. The policy piece. I think it's also important to think about strategic partners with School of Medicine, for example, with pulmonary, right? Thinking about some of their data sciences pieces they are building and how they might interface with some of our priorities. But yes, I think there's huge, and that's where the potential is for these kind of this more collaborative curriculum model as well.
Great, well, thank you so much, Beth. for
Thank you,
your
guys.
thoughts. Thank you.